The screams echoed through the canyon for only a moment before silence swallowed them whole. But the herd of wild Mustangs grazing in the valley below had heard everything. Their ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as they watched the wheelchair tumble end over end down the rocky cliff face, a young woman's body limp inside it. What happened next would prove that sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or badges. Sometimes it comes on four hooves, driven by an ancient instinct that humans had long forgotten. Nobody in Millbrook County had ever questioned Richard Thornhill's devotion to his daughter. Why would they? The tech mogul had moved his entire empire to this remote corner of Montana 5 years ago, right after the accident that had left 20-year-old Sarah paralyzed from the waist down. He'd built a sprawling ranch house with every accessibility feature money could buy, hired the best physical therapists, and seemingly dedicated his life to her care. The town admired him. The local newspaper had even run a feature story calling him Father of the Year. But money, as Sarah had learned in the cruelest possible way, couldn't buy a genuine heart. The truth was far darker than anyone knew. Richard Thornhill hadn't moved to Montana for his daughter's recovery, he'd moved to hide her. Sarah had been the golden child once, the Stanford-bound prodigy who'd discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. In the weeks before her accident, she'd been helping her father organize some files when she stumbled upon evidence of massive financial fraud. Richard Thornhill's billions weren't built on innovation. They were built on stolen pension funds, manipulated stocks, and destroyed lives. When she'd confronted him, he'd smiled that cold smile she'd never seen before. "You're young, Sarah. You don't understand how the world works." She'd understood enough to threaten going to the authorities. 2 days later, her brakes had failed on a mountain road. The car had plunged into a ravine. The doctors called her survival miraculous. Sarah called it a nightmare because she knew, that her father had orchestrated it all. But she'd had no proof, no way to escape, and no one who would believe that the beloved Richard Thornhill was capable of attempted murder. So she'd waited, watched, and planned, gathering evidence piece by piece from his home office while he thought her too broken to be a threat. Then he'd found her flash drive. That morning had started like any other. Maria, the housekeeper who'd become Sarah's only real ally, had helped her into the wheelchair and made breakfast. But when Richard appeared in the doorway, his face was a mask of contained rage. In his hand was the flash drive, years of secretly compiled evidence that could send him to prison for life. "I gave you a second chance," he'd said quietly. "I let you live after the first time. That was my mistake." Maria had gasped, finally understanding. But before she could react, Richard had locked her in the pantry. Sarah had tried to wheel herself away, but her father was faster. He'd grabbed the wheelchair handles and pushed her out the back door, across the wooden deck, and toward the private trail that led to Eagle's Precipice, the highest point on his property, where the land simply dropped away into a 200-foot canyon. "They'll think you wheeled yourself out here," he'd said conversationally as he pushed her along the rocky path. "Depression is common among people with your condition. Everyone knows you've been struggling. Such a tragedy." Sarah had fought, screaming and grabbing at branches, rocks, anything. But Richard was strong, determined, and utterly without mercy. When they reached the cliff's edge, he'd paused for just a moment, looking at the daughter he was about to murder. "I'm sorry it came to this," he'd said. And he didn't sound sorry at all. Then he'd shoved the wheelchair over the edge. The wild Mustangs had been there for generations, a herd of about 30 horses that roamed freely across the valley floor, protected by federal law and mostly unbothered by humans. Their leader was a massive dun stallion the locals called Ghost because of the pale, almost silver color of his coat. He was old by wild horse standards, wise and wary, with scars that told stories of survival. Ghost had seen the wheelchair fall. He'd watched it crash against the rocks, bounce, and come to rest in a twisted heap near the creek bed. And he'd seen the girl, somehow thrown clear during the fall, lying motionless in the tall grass 30 feet away from the wreckage. Horses are prey animals, hardwired to flee from danger. But horses are also deeply empathetic creatures, capable of sensing distress in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. As the herd gathered around Ghost, stamping nervously and ready to bolt, the stallion made a decision that defied every instinct in his body. He walked toward the girl. Sarah regained consciousness to the warm breath of a horse on her face. Pain radiated through her body. She'd broken ribs, certainly, maybe her arm, and her head throbbed where it had struck a rock. But miraculously, impossibly, she was alive. The wheelchair had taken the brunt of the impact, and she'd been thrown into the one patch of deep grass soft enough to cushion her fall. She tried to move and cried out. The horse, a magnificent stallion with a coat like moonlight, stepped back but didn't flee. Instead, he lowered his head and nickered softly. Behind him, the rest of the herd watched, nervous but curious. Sarah had grown up riding horses, back when her legs had worked, back when her father had actually loved her, or so she'd thought. She knew their body language, their gentle nature despite their size and strength. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't know if she was comforting the horse or herself. Ghost seemed to understand that she couldn't move on her own. He positioned himself beside her and lowered himself carefully to the ground, a vulnerable position for a wild animal, one that spoke volumes about his intent. Sarah understood. Using her arms and her remaining strength, she dragged herself across his back, draping herself over him like a blanket. The stallion rose slowly, carefully, with Sarah clinging to his mane. Then, surrounded by his protective herd, Ghost began to walk. It was nearly 6 miles from Eagle's Precipice to the main road, Ware Drive. James Morrison was driving home from a house call. James had been Millbrook's country doctor for 20 years, and he'd seen a lot of strange things, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a herd of wild Mustangs walking in formation down the shoulder of the highway, with a battered young woman draped across the lead stallion's back. He'd slammed on his brakes and jumped out, medical instincts overriding his shock. Sarah Thornhill. He'd breathed, recognizing Richard's daughter. The horses had let him approach, another miracle. Ghost had stood perfectly still while James carefully lifted Sarah down and assessed her injuries. She was hypothermic, in shock, and badly hurt, but alive. As James called for an ambulance, Sarah had grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength. "My father," she'd gasped. "He pushed me. He tried to kill me." The flash drive. Evidence. Hidden in Maria's room, under the floorboard by the window. "Promise me. Promise you'll tell them." James had promised, though his mind reeled with the implications. Richard Thornhill. Impossible. But as he'd looked into Sarah's eyes, he'd seen only truth. The ambulance had arrived within 15 minutes. As the paramedics loaded Sarah onto the stretcher, she turned her head one last time to look at Ghost. The stallion had stood watching, his herd gathered protectively around him. And in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, a gratitude, an acknowledgement of the inexplicable bond between two beings who'd saved each other's lives. The scandal had erupted like a wildfire. Maria, freed from the locked pantry by confused staff hours later, had corroborated Sarah's story. The flash drive was exactly where she'd said it would be, containing evidence of fraud spanning 2 decades and involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard Thornhill had been arrested within 24 hours, his protests of innocence falling on deaf ears when investigators found Sarah's wheelchair at the bottom of Eagle's Precipice and tire tracks showing how it had been pushed. The trial had been national news. Sarah, recovering slowly but steadily in the hospital, had testified from a video link, her voice strong despite her injuries. The courtroom had fallen silent as she described her father's cold calculation, his willingness to murder his own daughter twice to protect his secrets. Richard Thornhill was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The stolen money was recovered and returned to its rightful owners, working people who'd lost their retirement savings, their homes, their futures. And Sarah, the daughter who'd been brave enough to stand up to a monster, became the unexpected trustee of what remained of her father's legitimate assets. A year later, Sarah had made a full recovery from her injuries, though she remained paralyzed, some things even the strongest spirit couldn't overcome. But she'd turned her tragedy into purpose. Using her inheritance and the speaking fees from telling her story, she'd established the Thornhill Foundation, dedicated to prosecuting white-collar crime and supporting victims of financial fraud. And she'd done something else too. She'd purchased 2,000 acres of Montana ranchland adjacent to where the Mustangs roamed, creating a permanent protected corridor for the wild horses. She'd built a small house there, accessible and comfortable, where she could see the herd grazing from her window each morning. Ghost still led his family, though his muzzle had more gray now. He'd been sedated once, gently and carefully, so veterinarians could check his health and fit him with a tracker for research purposes. He was estimated to be 24 years old, ancient for a wild Mustang, but still strong, still wise, still watching over his herd. Some evenings, Sarah would wheel herself out to the fence line and simply sit there, watching the horses. And sometimes, though not always, Ghost would approach. He'd lower his head over the fence, and Sarah would stroke his face, this creature who defied every instinct to save her life. "Thank you," she'd whisper. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." The local news had tried to make the story about the dramatic rescue, about the trial, about justice served. But Sarah knew the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about a horse who'd chosen compassion over fear. It was about recognizing that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from confronting evil but from choosing kindness when it would be easier to turn away. In a world that often felt devoid of genuine humanity, Ghost and his herd had shown more empathy than the man who'd called himself her father. They'd reminded Sarah, and through her story, reminded countless others, that goodness exists in unexpected places. That being vulnerable enough to help someone, even at great risk, is the truest form of strength. And that sometimes, the animals we think of as wild are actually the ones who remember best what it means to be truly human.